Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Welcome to episode 54 of It's Murder Up North. Today's case has been suggested by Craig Danson, who is a fantastic supporter of the show. He messaged me with this story and was kind enough to reflect on how it affected him. I truly hope I do it justice for you, Craig. Now, there are a few people I want to give special thanks to, but first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for your kind messages whilst I've been unwell. You're all wonderful, and it means a lot to have your support. Now, to Ella Roo, it is always great to hear that the cases I cover have touched people, and I really appreciate your 5-star review. Bob Cherry 1, thank you so much for your review, and I will definitely do my best to say Argus instead of Angus next time. JJ1975, thank you for recommending the show. Your support is wonderful. And I just want to say welcome to our newest Patreon member, Mary King. It's great to know that you're enjoying the show all the way in America. At the end of this episode, I will be playing the trailer for a very special series from the podcast Riddle Me That, in which Jules will cover the tragic case of Jacob Landin, a baby whose family have been fighting for justice since his death. Please stay tuned and give the series a listen. Now, let's head to the episode. Brixton in South London is a well-known area of the capital, with its rich culture and famous market. It established itself as a major shopping centre with the construction of the first purpose-built department store in 1877. It was also renowned for being one of the first places to utilise electric lights within its shopping arcades, now known as the famous Electric Avenue. Prior to the Second World War, it was predominantly a middle-class area, with easy access to the City of London, and it became an increasingly popular place to shop. In 1932, Frederick Sewell was born in this bustling part of London. But when World War II broke out in 1939, 7-year-old Frederick was one of thousands of children who was placed on a train and sent off to the safety of the countryside. On the 2nd of September 1939, the Daily Mirror reported on what was named Operation Pied Piper. The paper recorded, quote, "Evacuation of schoolchildren from London went without a hitch. The children, smiling and cheerful, left their parents and entrained for unknown destinations in the spirit of going on a great adventure." This sounded like a very pleasant experience. But for these children, they were leaving behind their parents, their friends, and everything they knew, not knowing when they would be returning, or what they would be coming home to. Frederick was sent to Cornwall. Alighting the train, he was lined up with his fellow evacuees, to be selected by a family, who took him back to their farmhouse, where he would spend the next 8 years of his life. It was while on the farm that he acquired the taste for the life of a country gentleman, with ambitions of owning his own large estate, with plenty of land for hunting and keeping horses. In 1947, at the age of 15, Frederick returned to a very different Brixton. The German bombs had destroyed many of the buildings and had caused the community to splinter. The teenager worked on completing his education, but he would have his first run-in with the law when he was accused of stealing 300 ball-bearing races. These are utilised in a wide range of items with moving parts, allowing for frictionless motion. To be honest, I don't know exactly what the purpose of stealing these would be, although I'm presuming it was possibly with the intention of selling them. Frederick was, however, acquitted of this offence. After he had left school, Frederick began his working life in a print shop. Upon quitting this job, he then worked as a page boy, which entailed him working in domestic service. And then he took employment working in a men's clothing shop. At the beginning of the 1950s, Frederick left behind the hustle and bustle of London in exchange for the countryside of Kent, where he went to help one of his brothers run a large pig farm. Here he was able to continue his passion for all things mechanical, spending hours repairing old vehicles and other items. And this, that started as a hobby, would soon become his business. In January 1949, peacetime national service became compulsory, meaning that all able-bodied males between the ages of 17 and 21 had to serve 18 months in one of the branches of the armed forces. Having completed this term, they would then be held on the reserve list for a further 4 years, from which they could be called up to serve again. Frederick Sewell received his conscription notice, yet he failed to attend at the allotted time. Instead, he went on the run. While avoiding national service, Frederick met and subsequently married a lady called Joyce. Yet he couldn't run forever, and he was apprehended and taken to begin his national service. By all accounts, Sewell refused to serve his time in the army. He fled from his duties on 3 separate occasions, and after the third escape he was arrested and sentenced to 9 months in a detention centre. Having served his time, Frederick would be on the police radar once more when he had participated in an attempt to steal £37,000, roughly £1.2 million today. This money was intended to pay employees at a business in Nottingham. Frederick had been identified as the getaway driver in the operation, but it would take over a year for him to be arrested for his part in the crime. Frederick was sentenced to prison time, but unlike previous occasions when he had returned to his wife Joyce, this time he abandoned her. The couple would later get divorced, and he would take up residence with a woman called Irene Germain, who had attended school with Frederick and had been besotted with him for years. With his fondness for mechanics, Frederick established a car dealership, which earned him a substantial wage. He began to indulge in the lifestyle he aspired to lead since being evacuated to the farm in Cornwall. He purchased a country house in Surrey, where he lived with Irene, and Frederick became a well-known face around the affluent areas of London, where he would eat in the most exclusive restaurants, drink the most expensive wines, and often spent long nights in the nightclubs. While infatuated Irene remained at her home in Surrey, Frederick would have numerous flings, becoming a prolific womanizer. Yet he was careful to ensure that his girlfriends were blissfully unaware of each other. While in a nightclub in London, Frederick began an affair with Barbara Palmer, and he proceeded to purchase a 2-bedroomed house for them to live in. However, unbeknownst to Barbara, Frederick continued his relationship with Irene, frequently going to the house in Surrey, where he would spend time hunting. As I said, he was a prolific womanizer, and despite already leading a double life with 2 women, it wasn't enough for Frederick, and he had a 3rd girlfriend called Julie Lavinia, whom he would go on to marry, although the betrothal was kept secret, allowing Frederick to continue his relationships with Irene and Barbara. The marriage between Frederick and Julie ended before the 70s began, and the couple divorced, but he maintained his relationship with Irene and Barbara, and he spent most of his time with Irene, with the intention that they were to marry. By all accounts, Frederick was an ambitious man who had proven to be successful in business. At the age of 39, he had expanded his car dealership and had a number of properties, including a flat in London and the 2 houses in Kent and Surrey. In 1971, Irene and Frederick rented a flat in the seaside town of Blackpool, just a couple of minutes away from the seafront and the famous tower. Here, he would meet up with a number of acquaintances who would travel up from London. These included Charlie Haynes, who owned a nightclub in King's Cross, Johnny Spry, Dennis Bond, and Thomas Flanagan. The 4 men and Sewell would later be dubbed the Crazy Gang. Each had a criminal background or had known associations with gangs. Charlie Haynes was a friend of Dennis Bond, with whom Sewell had participated in the Nottingham wage theft, which had resulted in both men serving prison terms. Johnny Spry had been known to the police since he was a child and had a long list of criminal offences to his name. The first time the 5 men met in the seaside town, they walked the streets and visited the various attractions, dressed in black suits and sunglasses, which was an odd choice for a hot summer's day when people around them were dressed in shorts and t-shirts and summer dresses. Later that month, the gang made another trip to Blackpool. This time, their outfits were more low-key and they were able to blend in with the crowds as they perused the various shops throughout the town. Despite their inconspicuous actions on the streets, they attracted attention to themselves in the hotels by paying for their rooms using high-value notes. Once again, the men returned to London. Just prior to the 23rd of August, the 5 men returned once more to the town. They drove north in 2 cars, a green Triumph 2000 and a bronze Ford Capri, both of which had been stolen and were now being driven under false plates. Upon arriving in Blackpool, Frederick went to his rented flat with Irene, and the other 4 members of the group took up accommodation in a boarding house, clearly learning from their previous mistakes of drawing unwanted attention to themselves. On a narrow alleyway in Blackpool stands the rear entrance of a Chinese takeaway, surrounded by nightclubs and empty premises. The famous tower is just visible through the gaps in the neighbouring street. This unassuming place, which sits just behind the promenade on a narrow street called the Strand, hidden away from the holiday-makers, day-trippers and revellers, was once the site of a row of shops, including Preston's Jewellers, with its marble frontage and curved windows displaying an array of sparkling jewels, watches and trinkets. Unbeknownst to the staff, the shop was being watched by Frederick and his gang, who had identified it as an ideal target. Having observed the store on previous visits, they had noted the routines of the staff and saw that despite the high-value items on display, the store had limited security in place. On the morning of August the 23rd, 1971, the gang made their move. The shop staff had just started opening up for the day, busying themselves with cleaning the glass stands and arranging the displays. Outside was a warm and sunlit day, and the promenade was already bustling with sunseekers. At 9:41 a.m, the shop had a number of customers perusing the stands of elegant jewellery, when suddenly the door was flung open and 4 men barged in, each brandishing a weapon. Issuing the usual threats to the staff and customers, they were able to quickly bring those gathered under control, forcing them to lie face down on the floor, and the 4 men started to ransack the neatly laid out stands. One of the robbers attempted to open a door behind the counter, but found it was locked. The staff insisted that only the manager had the key, and he was on a day off. This was, however, a lie, and behind the door, the manager, Joseph Lamond, had activated the silent alarm, which in turn notified the police. Despite a couple of feeble attempts to break down the door, the crook gave up and proceeded to smash up the cabinets, snatching anything he could grab. The men paused in their activities when a man entered the shop, wearing a smart black uniform with silver numbers emblazoned on the shoulder lapels. Frederick approached the man and held a rifle to his abdomen. He instructed the newcomer to get down on the floor, and as the man got to his knees, he was knocked unconscious. It was assumed that the gang thought this individual was a police officer. However, he was a firefighter called Ronald Gale, who had just been passing the shop and had observed the robbery in progress. Having asked a nearby shopkeeper to call the police, Gale had then entered the shop to try and assist the staff. The intervention of Ronald Gale caused Frederick to instruct the rest of the group to flee. He was the last to exit, tripping over his feet and struggling to carry his heavy haul and wield his gun. He inadvertently dropped precious jewels on the floor as he ran off down the street. They hurriedly rushed to an open area known as Queen Square, where the green Triumph 2000 stood waiting for them, and like a scene from a comedy sketch, they struggled to open the doors, only to learn that they were locked. When the bumbling quartet managed to get into the vehicle, it stalled, and as the driver, Charlie Haynes, frantically attempted to restart the engine, the familiar sight of a blue and white police panda car emerged around the corner, driven by PC Carl Walker, who attempted to block the robber's path. but the Triumph managed to evade capture and drove off northbound along the promenade. They then proceeded to turn right onto Cocker Street and then left onto back Warbrick Street, where the gang had parked the bronze Ford Capri, which they planned to use as a secondary getaway vehicle. But as they prepared to make the transfer, they were spotted by PC Carl Walker. Reversing rapidly out of the alleyway, the 5 gang members attempted to lose the Panda car, but as they turned right onto Lord Street, the police car, driven by PC Walker, blocked their path. But the Triumph didn't slow down. It was now being controlled by Frederick, who unflinchingly rammed the Panda car, pushing it out of the way and allowing them to continue their flight. Recollecting the events that day, PC Walker remembered having a gun pointed at him. Before the Triumph was driven into the side of his vehicle, he stated, quote, "They rammed me and smashed my Panda car across the road." More officers had now joined the pursuit, including PC Ian Hampson, who attempted to keep track of the vehicle, following the gang as they attempted to return to their alternate car. But they couldn't lose the tenacious officer, and were forced to abort their transfer attempt once again. The green Triumph containing the 5 men returned to the promenade. Once again heading north, they abruptly took a right onto Dixon Road, now entering a residential part of the town. PC Ian Hampson caught up with them and pursued them along Edgerton Road, speeding swiftly past the terraced houses, the siren of the Panda car squealing and tyres screeching as it turned into Clevedon Road. Gaining rapidly on the Triumph, it brakes suddenly, forcing the police car to come to a halt. PC Hampson quickly left his vehicle, and he looked up just in time to see Johnny Spray pointing a gun at him. Before he could react, the officer was shot in the chest, and the gang continued their escape. Now, with more police cars entering the area, the fugitives didn't get much further down the road, when the Triumph was rammed by a police car, immobilising it. The 5 men quickly emerged from the vehicle, holding their weapons. Charles Haynes fired a warning shot towards the unarmed officers, forcing them to take cover, giving the gang a head start as they fled on foot. Charles Haynes concealed his pistol as he ran, and rounded a corner, where he came to a crowd of people enjoying the summer's day. He merged into the crowd, and was able to evade capture. Frederick Sewell, the leader of the gang, did not flee. Instead, he too opened fire, his bullet striking Detective Andy Hillis 3 times. But this did not stop the injured officer, who joined the foot pursuit and was able to tackle Thomas Flanagan. Now, with 1 gang member apprehended, the focus turned to capturing the other 4. However, with Charles Haynes merging into the hordes of people, the pursuit concentrated on the 3 remaining men. They had headed off down a side street, with multiple officers following them. This included PC Carl Walker, who had been the first officer to encounter the gang, resulting in his car being driven into. However, he had managed to catch up with the action. PC Walker was faced with the 3 men running towards him. But as they got closer to him, Frederick Sewell paused and fired, hitting the officer in the groin. Despite the searing pain, the constable continued to limp towards the gang, hoping to at least stop one of them. He recalled, quote, "I thought if I could just get one of them, I would be happy. Sewell raised his gun at me again, so I just dropped to the floor. That was the last part I played in the day." Having injured another officer, the trio now stole a butcher's van, which was parked up while the driver was making a delivery. Sewell got behind the wheel and sped away from the scene, but once again the Blackpool police officers were close behind them, including Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson. Just 2 minutes after stealing the van, it crashed into a wall, and the police quickly attempted to contain the fugitives, including leaning against the rear doors to prevent them from opening, but the gang managed to clamber out of the stricken vehicle. 39-year-old Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson pursued Frederick Sewell. The 2 men were matched in age and determination, but unfortunately for Sewell, he ended up in an alleyway with no way out except for his gun, which he proceeded to point at the inspector. Staring down the barrel of the rifle, Gerald Richardson was unfazed, as he calmly raised his hands and inched towards the armed man. He confidently spoke to Sewell, quote, "Don't be daft, don't be silly." He instructed Sewell to lower the weapon, but seeing the intent in the fugitive's eyes, the athletic Richardson swiftly tackled his opponent to the ground. The two men struggled on the floor, when suddenly a shot rang out, quickly followed by another. Sewell pushed the wounded officer away and raced from the scene. Within moments he had acquired a grey Morris van and managed to evade capture. The two remaining members of the gang were pursued by DS Ken McKay and DC Ted Hanley, who had followed them in a panda car. Johnny Spry attempted to shoot at the officers, but his gun misfired. DS McKay aimed his vehicle at Spry and Dennis Bond. The latter was struck by the vehicle, but was able to flee. While Spry barely managed to get out of the path of the car, he was clipped by it as he made his getaway. Yet DS McKay had not given up. He had exited the vehicle and chased down Spry. Lunging at him, the officer knocked the man to the pavement and restrained him. Meanwhile, DC Ted Hanley had caught up with Dennis Bond, whom the officer struck over the head with a broom handle, stunning him and ending his flight. Police had successfully apprehended Thomas Flanagan, Johnny Spry and Dennis Bond, but at a great cost to the force, with 4 officers being shot in the process. Detective Andy Hillis, PC Ian Hampson, PC Carl Walker, and Chief Superintendent Inspector Gerald Richardson. They had all been unarmed when they were shot in the line of duty. Andy Hillis and Ian Hampson would recover from their injuries. PC Carl Walker had been shot in the groin, yet miraculously the bullet missed all major arteries, bones and nerves. He recalled, quote, "In the hospital they told me if I was going to be shot it was the best place I could have been hit, but the dead tissue around it touches the sciatic nerve. It's like having toothache in your leg." Due to his standoff with Sewell, Gerald Richardson had received 2 bullet wounds at point-blank range to the abdomen. He was taken in an ambulance and accompanied by Carl, who, when he was 77 years old, gave an interview to the BBC, and despite the passage of time, he still vividly recalled his commanding officer's words, quote, "He told me, I had him by the throat, Carl, but he shot me." Carl proceeded to say, "You could tell by his eyes he was dying." Surgeons at Blackpool Victoria Hospital fought tirelessly to save Gerald Richardson's life, but his wounds were too extensive and he had suffered major blood loss. The officer would succumb to his injuries just 2 hours after being shot. With his passing, the Chief Superintendent, Gerald Richardson, would become the highest-ranking officer to be killed in the line of duty. But he was not only remembered for his position, but for his character. PC Walker fondly stated, "He was one of the best. He always called his policeman officer, and would never bully or shout at people. If there was something wrong, he just had a quiet word. He was always there if you needed him." In 1932, Irving and Lillian Richardson welcomed their son, Gerald Irving Richardson. The family resided in Norbrick, which sits approximately 3 miles away from the famous Blackpool Tower. Lillian would spend her days caring for Gerald and his sister Judith, whilst their father went out to work as a painter and decorator. From an early age, Gerald's parents encouraged his ambitious and hard-working nature. They saw he had an affinity for learning, and at the age of 11 he passed the entrance exams, which allowed him to attend Blackpool Grammar School. Here he would thrive, proving himself to be adept at anything he put his mind to. Always eager to expand his knowledge, his teachers would report that he showed a keen understanding of the subjects he studied, and he would likely be successful in whichever career he chose to pursue, due to his ambition and drive. By the age of 17 he had already determined the career path he wished to take, and upon leaving school he joined the police force as a cadet. Unlike Frederick Sewell, who fled from his national service, Gerald served his with distinction, spending 2 years working as a military police officer. In 1953, having completed his national service, Gerald returned to his hometown and began working as a police constable patrolling the streets of Blackpool. Being an officer was not just a career, it was a passion, and he enjoyed the challenges that he faced each day. But his personal life was also filled with happiness, having married his wife Maureen in 1956. Gerald proved himself to be an exemplary officer, who was commended for his service on 3 separate occasions. During one incident, Gerald assisted in the rescue of a man who had fallen from the pier into the sea. His actions and passion did not go unnoticed. He had shown himself to be a competent and compassionate officer, who was also a born leader, and as such he was appointed to the rank of Chief Superintendent at the age of 36, a remarkable achievement for such a young officer. Being in charge of the Blackpool force, Gerald faced many challenges. The seaside town was a haven not only for those looking to enjoy the attractions, but also to criminals, who took advantage of the fact that during the summer months the population of the town would swell, resulting in officers being spread thin on the ground. Criminals could also take advantage of the cheap hotels and excellent transport links to various parts of the country. Despite its challenges, Gerald was focused on ensuring Blackpool was a safe place for its residents, and wanted to provide opportunities for young people in the area, including assisting in the creation of a training facility. He also offered his support to local charities and community groups. Among his fellow officers, he was known for his charismatic personality and his hands-on approach, who despite his rank was not afraid to be hands-on when needed. He led by example and was an inspiration to those who followed him. And so his death had a wide-reaching effect not only on the town of Blackpool, but on police forces throughout the country and people who had never met him. When the officer was laid to rest, over 100,000 people came to the town to pay their respects. At the request of his wife Maureen, the service featured an open casket, allowing people to view Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson in his police uniform. The service was conducted at St John's Church, attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had been there 15 years earlier to witness the wedding of Gerald and Maureen. As the fallen officer was laid to rest, the hunt for the remaining fugitives, Frederick Sewell and Charles Haynes, continued, and while the mourners filed into the church, 150 miles away on the outskirts of Birmingham, the National Pony Championships were underway, an event which attracted many spectators. But on that day they would witness a different spectacle. As a man passed through the ticket booth, he was apprehended by some waiting officers, working on the information that Charles Haynes' 15-year-old daughter would be competing at the event. They decided to send out a team to see whether the wanted man would turn up to support his daughter. The hunch was correct, and Charles, who had acted as the getaway driver for the gang, was now in police custody. Frederick Sewell had managed to evade capture. Following the shooting of Gerald Richardson, he had made his way back to the flat he shared with Irene, which was just a few blocks away from where all the police activity was taking place. From the flat, he would have been acutely aware of the sounds of the emergency vehicles roaming the streets, and the ambulances, which were called upon to take the injured officers to hospital. He, however, was hidden, and the Blackpool force were unaware that he was concealed so close to the scene of the crime. Irene and Frederick waited for the police and crowds to dissipate. Then, as Irene drove, Frederick hid in the boot of the Ford Capri as they made their way out of Blackpool. Utilising the small country roads, they headed north towards the Lake District. From there they headed east across the country before joining the A1M, heading southbound towards London. Lancashire police were keen to apprehend the man responsible for the death of an officer, and they joined forces with the Metropolitan Police. With 20 officers deployed to London, unusually the hunt being led by an investigator from the Lancashire Constabulary. An animosity would come from this union of the two forces, when it was discovered that prior to Sewell and his gang heading north to commit the raid on the jewellery store, there were allegations that the Metropolitan Police had been aware of the gang's intentions. Yet it was decided that they should allow the group to carry out their plot. Lancashire Police were unaware that this gang were heading into their patch, and many would blame the Met Police's inactivity as a contributing factor to the death and wounding of fellow police officers. As the newspapers began reporting on the flight of the fugitive, interviews were conducted with people who had known Frederick, including his ex-wife Julie and her mother Kathleen, who during an interview in the Daily Mirror appealed for him to give himself up. Another interview was conducted with Frederick's mother, who was quoted as saying, "He is a good boy, who always fell on his feet." Police were convinced that Frederick was being aided by others, and during one press conference, an investigator commented on the fugitive's womanizing and theorized that it was one of these women that was assisting him. The Daily Mirror quoted one senior detective stating, "This man must be nothing short of fantastic on the love scene," with the article continuing, quote, "His big attractions for women are his free-spending ways and his laughing, happy-go-lucky outlook. Detectives assure Sewell is being sheltered by a woman, and hope that this could be his downfall." Police received reports that Sewell was in Reading, a town 35 miles east of London, and a pursuit began with Sewell at the wheel of a stolen Jaguar. Reaching speeds of 100 miles an hour, he was able to momentarily lose his pursuers, allowing him to abandon the vehicle and acquire a grey minivan, a description of which was quickly issued to other forces, the press, and the public. On the 8th of September, Irene Germain and Barbara Palmer, both of whom had been in relationships with Frederick, appeared in court, accused of aiding a fugitive. Irene, for her part in the crime, would be sentenced in March 1972, in which she was handed a 15-month jail term. Passing sentence, Mr. Justice Kilner Brown told Irene, quote, "I have great sympathy for you. You loved this man deeply. You were unaware he was leading a life of promiscuity and deceit. You believed you would be his wife-in-law. If I could have avoided sending you to prison, I would have done so, but my duty compels me to take this course. People have to be warned. They must not assist in grave cases of crime." Addressing Barbara Palmer, Justice Kilner Brown stated, "I regard you, in one sense, as yet another victim of the trail of havoc this man Sewell has created. It was extended to the women in his life and the children he fathered." Throughout September, the hunt for Frederick Sewell continued. Police reacted to every tip they received. They tracked down the suspect to a garage in Tooting, South London, after someone had claimed to have seen Sewell there, where he was known to have associations. But when officers arrived at the business, they did not find the wanted man. On another occasion, detectives were deployed to a farmhouse near Reigate, Surrey, which had been identified as a residence of Sewell's. Once again, the fugitive was one step ahead of them. It was evident that he had been in the property not long before the police arrived. He had allegedly gone to the farmhouse to collect some of his belongings, loading them into 2 suitcases and leaving. Frederick Sewell was leading the police on a wild goose chase throughout the south of England. He had been to see friends in Wandsworth, London, returning to Brixton for a short time. Then he was reported to have been in Staines, to the west of the City of London. With Frederick being associated with a number of properties, many houses and businesses were raided in the search for him, including his brother's farm in Kent. They had been working on information that the wanted man had been seen there, but once again he slipped through the net. On the 7th of October, 45 days since the murder of Gerald Richardson, a tip that Frederick was residing at a boarding house in South London led police to the home of a lady called Mrs. Pepper, who had recently taken in a new lodger called David. She would go on to advise the Daily Mirror about her tenant, advising that he was very helpful, he had offered to paint her kitchen for her, and he had also been very sympathetic when she hadn't won anything on her weekly bingo night. Mrs. Pepper proceeded to tell the paper that a week earlier a drunken man had been hammering on the door of the house and shouting, which caused her to be afraid. The following day she told David about the incident, and he advised her that if anything like that occurred again, she should let him know and he would deal with it. The landlady had no idea that the bearded man who called himself David and had been living under her roof was actually wanted by the police, information that clearly stunned Mrs. Pepper when she learned his true identity. Frederick Sewell was escorted from the property concealed under a blanket, and officers swiftly moved in to search the house, during which they discovered a rifle hidden under the mattress. On Monday the 11th of October 1971, Frederick returned to Blackpool, this time charged with the murder of Gerald Richardson. Still sporting his beard and dressed in a pinstripe suit and light grey shirt, Sewell appeared before the court to answer to the charge. The Coventry Evening News reported on the calm nature of the exchange between Sewell and the clerk. The defendant is asked if he agrees to be remanded to the police cells, to which Frederick responded, "I would prefer to go to Risley," which was a remand centre, "because I cannot have a wash where I am, but it doesn't matter." The clerk asked, "You were not unduly disturbed about it?" Sewell replied, "No." When advised by the court chairman that he would be remanded to the police cells, Sewell coolly replied, "Thank you." Now with all 5 men in custody, the trial date was set for February 1972. On the 20th of December, representatives for the 5 defendants appeared before the High Court, having requested that the trial, which had been set to take place in Manchester, should be moved, amidst fears that the proximity to Blackpool would impede the defendants' right to a fair trial, due to the negative feelings amongst the people of Lancashire regarding the crime the men were accused of committing. Mr. Justice Cantley denied this request, explaining his decision, quote, "There is no danger of an unfair trial in Manchester. You will get a hard-headed and tenacious jury." The trial commenced at Manchester Magistrates' Court at the beginning of February 1972. There was naturally a high level of public interest in the case, and stringent security measures were in place to ensure the proceedings could go ahead without disruption. Over the following 34 days, the all-male jury were privy to the full details of the case. A comprehensive account of the events leading up to and during the 23rd of August were provided, preceded by a description of the efforts to apprehend all 5 members of the gang, as well as a number of accomplices who assisted them in evading arrest. The jury were also escorted via bus to Blackpool, where they were given a first-hand view of the various sites involved in the crime. During the prosecution's 5-hour-long opening statement, the jury were advised by Attorney General Sir Peter Rawlinson QC about the 5 defendants. He stated their incompetence as robbers was matched only by their ruthlessness in the use of firearms to evade arrest. One of the first witnesses to take to the stand was Carl Walker, who had been the first officer to respond to the alarm at the jewellery shop. He advised the court that he did not know the reason for the alarm and was unaware that he was about to confront a group of armed men. The officer described how when he began his pursuit of the Triumph, he recalled that he was shot at twice. Fortunately, the bullets missed. He stated, quote, "I could see the black end of the pistol. It was pointed at me." He later explained the moment he was shot by Frederick Sewell, who had already fired at him once but missed. Quote, "I ran towards him and he fired again. He was about 6 feet away. Something hit me in the leg and I went down." While wounded on the floor, Officer Walker stated that he had observed the 3 men head towards the butcher's van. He told the court, "I tried to get up. The men were still at the rear of the van. The man who shot me had his back to me and he turned and stood right next to me. I got down again. He pointed the gun at me. The gun was about 2 feet from my head." Walker described his relief when another police vehicle approached, causing the gunman to run to the van and drive away. He explained that he sustained injuries to his groin and right leg during the shooting. Another officer who had also been shot by the fugitives was Detective Sergeant Andrew Hillis, who did not hold back in showing his contempt for Frederick Sewell. Pointing to the dock, DS Hillis said, "He fired twice at me as I went towards them. That thing there, you can't call him a man." Defence attorney Mr. John Platts Mills responded, "That creature, that thing, that is how you regard him. You refer to him as that creature, that thing in the dock. This is your attitude towards Sewell." Detective Sergeant Hillis replied passionately, "Remember something. He murdered a friend of mine." Mr. John Platts Mills continued to cross-examine D.S. Hillis, in which the officer claimed that Frederick Sewell had shot at him twice, from a distance of roughly 6 feet, as the officer got out of his car to apprehend the gang. Sergeant Hillis said, "It was the most frightening moment of my life. I could not believe the man was firing live ammunition." He proceeded to describe how he heard via his car radio that another officer had been shot. "I never realised he was going to shoot at me too." Mr. Platt Mills insinuated that the officer's account was not truthful. Quote, "I suggest he never shot at you." Sergeant Hillis retorted, "Ho ho, he did that." Despite the officer's passionate testimony, the jury were instructed by the judge to find all 5 defendants not guilty of the attempted murder of Detective Sergeant Hillis. Charles Haynes, who had acted as the group's getaway driver, denied being involved in the murder of Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson. He testified that having managed to evade capture, he had made his way to the apartment rented by Irene and Frederick. There, the 3 of them resided until the police had left the area, recalling Frederick stating, "Well, if they were coming here, surely they would have been here by now." Haynes continued to describe how they had headed north with Irene driving, Charles in the passenger seat, and Frederick hiding in the boot. He proceeded to claim that he only became aware of Gerald Richardson's death when they had arrived at a cafe in Windermere. He recalled Sewell reading a newspaper report about the robbery and murder. He told the jury, quote, "We went into a cafe and ordered a cup of tea. Mrs. Irene Germain had bought a paper, and we read about the shooting. That was the first I knew the policeman had died. Sewell had told me earlier that he had shot a policeman. I was shocked, absolutely shocked. I just sat speechless. I picked the paper up myself, but I could not read it. I said, 'This is terrible. I never expected anything like this to happen.' He alleged he told Sewell, 'I would not have had anything to do with it if I had known guns were going to be used.' I asked him if anyone else had had a gun, and he said, 'John had a gun.'" Haynes concluded his testimony by explaining that they left Windermere, headed north for a while before crossing the country into Yorkshire, where they made their way south. He claimed that Irene and Frederick dropped him off at his home in London, and that was the last he saw of them. The next of the defendants to fall under scrutiny was John Spry. The Attorney General, Sir Peter Rawlinson QC, advised that when John Spry had been apprehended by officers, the defendant claimed he had lost his memory, and proceeded to sit in the interview room during questioning, holding his head in his hands, and refusing to provide his name. In a written statement, Spry claimed that he had only become involved in the robbery following a meeting with a man on the previous Friday, who advised him that he had a job for him in Blackpool. He denied any knowledge of the guns until they were produced from a hold-all just before they were due to carry out the raid. In his statement, he claimed, quote, "If I had known guns were going to be used, I would not have stayed for the job. I even had an argument in the car with them about guns. I didn't want guns to be used. Had I known things were going to turn out as they did, I would not have gone." He proceeded to explain that the raid went wrong almost as soon as they entered the shop, and when a man in a uniform entered the store, they panicked. The man, Mr. Gale, was rendered unconscious, and Spry described how they got into the Triumph, which was then pursued by police until the car was immobilised by one of them ramming it. He told the court that as they all clambered to escape, quote, "Somebody shouted, 'Don't leave anything behind.'" He alleged that he picked up a gun at this point, just because he was following instructions, and responded to the prosecutor's questioning regarding him having a gun, stating that he only picked up the weapon, he did not shoot anyone with it. Spry then described how they commandeered the butcher's van, quote, "I dived into the back of the van, and the next thing the van crashed or was rammed, and I ran off and waved the revolver at the police running after me. The prosecutor accused him of threatening Sergeant Mackay with the weapon, to which the defendant argued that he had no intention of firing it, he just wanted to frighten the officer. It was then reported that when Spry was notified of Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson's death, he replied, "God, he's not dead, is he?" John Spry concluded his testimony by acknowledging his role in the robbery, but denied being responsible for the murder of Gerald Richardson. Thomas Flanagan's initial defence, when first questioned by police, was that he had been arrested by mistake and was just an innocent bystander. He then changed this to say that he had been kidnapped by the gang, who had forced him into the car as they fled from the jewellery shop. To these statements, Sir Peter Rawlinson advised the jury, quote, "You would dismiss this story with robust common sense." He would later tell officers, upon learning that a policeman had been killed during the raid, quote, "Christ, this was a real panic job. All hell seemed to break loose, you know, but, honest, I did no shooting. You know, I only went in with a case." Just like his co-defendants, Flanagan conceded that he played a part in the burglary, but he too pleaded not guilty to murder. 21 days into the trial, Frederick Sewell took to the stand. His defence attorney, Mr. Platt Mills, explained that 4 days prior to the planned raid, the defendant, accompanied by John Spry, entered a pub in London, where they planned to acquire a car. However, the man selling the stolen vehicles insisted that he would only sell the car as part of a deal, which included a selection of guns. Sewell agreed to this deal, alleged that they only took the guns with them to use as, quote, "threateners," proceeding to claim he was unaware that the guns were loaded until they were attempting to get away after the robbery. Less than a week after making this statement, Sewell then added to it by claiming that he had gone to Blackpool with the intention of marrying Irene, and the couple had planned to spend their honeymoon in the Lake District. Sewell claimed, quote, "I was selling a car to Dennis Bond, and told him I was going up there. He asked me if I could get him a flat. I did so, but I was not very keen." He claimed that he didn't want anything to do with the raid, and he had tried to get out of it, but was put under, quote, "a considerable amount of pressure." Detailing what occurred on that fateful day of the raid, Sewell explained how once they fled the Triumph on foot, quote, "Eventually we all panicked. There was some fighting and I ran into 3 policemen. He then described how he was pursued by Gerald Richardson, quote, 2 of them stayed back, but one chased me around the corner. He dived at me and we went on the floor. His head hit my chest, and he grabbed me around the neck with his hands. Mr. Richardson was on top of me on the floor. I tried to keep my feet, but I just went back on the floor with too much weight. I went to my right towards the wall. The gun was on the floor in between me and Mr. Richardson. When we hit the floor, that was when the gun went off. I did not intend the gun to go off. I was trying to get it away from him and stop myself going back at the same time. When I realised the gun had gone off, I was horrified." He proceeded to recall that the officer said, "You have shot me." Sewell then proceeded to describe, quote, "I went to the van, which had 2 people in it. They got out. I drove around, then parked the van and struggled back to the flat. At that point, Charlie Haynes came and we went out to Blackpool." Responding to Sewell's claim that the shooting was an accident, Sir Peter Rawlinson claimed that Sewell's version was a lie. He told the jury, "You may think it was no accident that Sewell was carrying a gun, no accident that it was loaded, and no accident that it had been used previously. There was not just 1 shot, but 2 at Superintendent Richardson. 2 accidents?" The Attorney General concluded by stating that it was the second shot that killed the policeman, fired at point-blank range. Earlier in the trial, Detective Chief Superintendent John Monsey, who was head of Lancashire CID, testified to the interviews he had conducted with Frederick Sewell following his apprehension, reporting the following exchange. Sewell told Monsey about the botched raid and the shooting of Gerald Richardson. "The job went wrong from start to finish. I shall see him every day of my life. He just kept coming. He would not go back. He was too brave. He should not have dived at me." Mr. Maunsey asked Sewell whether he shot Richardson. He claims Sewell replied, "You know I shot him. I wish I could turn the clock back. I did not get up in the mornings thinking, I'm going to shoot a man. What can I say?" According to the officer, the defendant continued, "It was funny. When I was sitting outside the shop that morning, I was praying that those in the shop would not open the safe. The others with me were praying that they would. If they had not opened the safe, the job was off. And they would have had to come back another time, and I would not have been there. I was getting married the following day, and that was all that bothered me." Mr. Maunsey said Sewell told him, "I was only standing for a fellow who broke his arm, and if they had had to come back, his arm might have been better, and I would have missed it." However, during cross-examination by prosecutor Geoffrey Heilpern, Frederick Sewell denied that he made any of the statements that Mr. Maunsey alleged he had made during interviews. Mr. Heilpern asked Sewell, "Did you tell them I can still see his face? Everything that went on. It's like a nightmare seeing it." Sewell stated, "I think one of the police officers said it must have been a nightmare seeing it." The prosecutor inquired, "And it has gone down on the police officer's record that you said it?" "Yes," responded Sewell. "During the weeks you were lying low in London, had you been thinking about what you had done?" "Yes," said the defendant. "Had it been like a nightmare?" "No," Sewell replied calmly. Mr. Heilpern asked if Sewell said, "I'll get locked away for life. Any one of us could have done it, but it had to be me." Sewell responded, "I didn't say it, but one of the policemen did." The prosecutor then pointed out, "Virtually everything I have put to you, you have said, I didn't say it. So all this really is conjured out of the police officer's imagination." Sewell replied, "I presume so, as I didn't say it." In closing, the prosecution reminded the jury that Frederick Sewell was the man who fired the fatal shot. However, all 5 men are guilty, as they all had possession of firearms during the robbery. The defence instructed the jury, quote, "Feelings of admiration for the police and sympathy for Mrs. Richardson, sorrow and regret are all matters calculated to disturb your judgment and prevent you from coming to a rational verdict on evidence. We all share in the sense of public outrage at the events which occurred on that melancholy Monday last year. All feel sorrow that a courageous officer met his death because he followed his duty, and perhaps most of all feel sorrow with the unhappy widow of that police officer whom we have seen in daily attendance upon this trial, and who now, no doubt, anxiously awaits your verdict. But there is another side to the trial. It is the side that calls for public justice to be administered in sober, critical, calm, and rational manner." End quote. When the verdicts were returned, each member of the gang was sentenced as followed. Dennis George Bond received 15 years. He was found not guilty of the attempted murder of the 4 officers, and not guilty of conspiracy to use firearms. Charles Haynes, who had acted as the getaway driver, received the shortest sentence of 10 years for robbery. He was found not guilty of the attempted murder of the 4 officers and not guilty of conspiracy to use firearms. John Spry was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder and 20 years for the manslaughter of Gerald Richardson, plus another 25 years for the attempted murder of P.C. Carr Walker. He was also given a 15-year sentence for conspiring to use firearms and a 15-year sentence for robbery, all to be served concurrently. Thomas Flanagan was found guilty of armed robbery and was sentenced to 13 years. He too was found not guilty of the attempted murder of the 4 officers and not guilty of conspiracy to use firearms. Frederick Sewell was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Mr. Justice Kilner Brown said, "I do not sentence you in any spirit of revenge. It is necessary not only to sentence you in relation to your own part and on your own character, but also as a warning that any man who shoots down a police officer in the course of his duty must expect the severest punishment which is permitted. Sewell stood motionless as the judge proceeded to give him a further sentence of 20 years for the attempted murder of P.C. Walker, 15 years for conspiracy to use firearms to prevent arrest, and another 15 years for the robbery. All these sentences, including the 30 years for murder, were to run concurrently. Maureen Richardson displayed great poise and dignity as she sat through the entirety of the proceedings. At the conclusion of the 34-day ordeal, she stated, "As I look ahead, it looks like a void. I say to myself that I will think about tomorrow. I wanted to see that justice was done, but certainly did not go to gloat over the fates of these men. This thing has altered my whole life, and I felt entitled to be here." Even in her grief, she showed compassion, one reporter stating their admiration when the widow stated, "I saw Mrs. Spry at the trial yesterday. I didn't speak to her, but I knew it was a bad day for her as it was for me." Frederick Sewell was sent to Liverpool jail to serve his sentence. Following the trial, there were calls to reinstate the death penalty from many senior figures in both the police force and Parliament. But his sentence remained unchanged, and the man who murdered Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson spent 30 years behind bars, during which time he sold his businesses, houses and shop, and amassed a substantial fortune. According to the Sunday People, Sewell left prison a millionaire and had allegedly commissioned the construction of a luxury country mansion. One of the builders told the Sunday People, "It is due to be finished for the middle of next month, and Mr. Sewell regularly visits to see how we are getting on." The place cost £235,000, which is the total price of the house and plot of land. We got together with Mr. Sewell and some architects, and he basically told us the design he wanted. No expense has been spared. The bathroom is being specially tiled and has a luxury suite. The wood finish on the front and side of the house is also costing more. There is a state-of-the-art fitted kitchen with dishwasher, which has added even more to the price. We've also fitted a huge open fireplace in the lounge and built a patio outside. It's a beautiful property and hand-built to Mr. Sewell's specifications. It's reported that Frederick Sewell moved into the home with Barbara Palmer, who had continued to stand by him throughout his prison sentence, and having served his time, he has now returned to the lifestyle he enjoyed 30 years earlier. This has been met with mixed feelings by those involved in the case. A fellow inmate was reported as saying, "He's done his time, good luck to him," while others were less supportive of the fact that Sewell had been released, including Paul Walker, who was shot and injured during the raid. He told the Sunday People, "He's going to come out to live the life of Riley. Murderers of police officers should never be freed. It's an insult to their memory. I would sue him if I could, but it's too late." In the town of Blackpool, the heroic actions of Chief Superintendent Gerald Richardson are still remembered. He remains the highest-ranking officer to have died in the line of duty, but his hometown keeps his memory alive. Following his death, the Blackpool North Rotary Club, of which he was a proud member, established the Chief Superintendent Richardson Memorial Youth Trust, which, as reported by the Lancashire Constabulary, aims to promote youth development by supporting young people aged 25 and under to attend courses and activities of an educational, cultural, sporting, adventurous or character-building nature. The Trust continues to support the youth of Blackpool and thus continues Superintendent Richardson's legacy. In 2016, a memorial stone was unveiled on the site of his former school, and in 2018 the road to the new police headquarters was named in his honour, with Assistant Chief Constable Terry Woods stating, "It is fitting that this road is named after Superintendent Richardson, a leader whose bravery we will never forget. The name of this road will act as a reminder to our officers and the public of the sacrifice he made that day. It also acts as a stark reminder of the risks that our officers face on a daily basis in the course of their duties." Thank you for joining me for episode 54 of It's Murder Up North. Episode 55 will be available next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Hi, I'm Jules from Riddle Me That True Crime.
I'm Robin Warder from The Trail Went Cold, and Jules and I want to tell you a little bit about a case that means a great deal to us. The death of 9-month-old baby Jacob Landin on April the 10th, 1987 in Socorro, New Mexico.
The day prior to his death, on April 9th, baby Jacob was being watched by his mother Brenda's new boyfriend John, not his real name, in his mobile home on 1453 Fatima Drive. While John was babysitting Jacob, Jacob would incur what would be his second head injury in a period of weeks. The prior head injury was a subdural hematoma, or brain bleed, and it was serious enough that it needed to be lanced to take pressure off baby Jacob's brain while being monitored by doctors over the course of several days.
The circumstances surrounding how Jacob was injured and subsequently died are murky at best, with the suspect giving multiple versions of the events of the day, ranging from Jacob choking and accidentally hitting his head while trying to dislodge a cookie, to Jacob falling and John returning to see the injured infant.
The suspect also reportedly confessed to officers that he was indeed responsible, but there is no paper or audio record of this confession in the police file. The reasons given by the DA for not pursuing the case are confusing as well, with one of the reasons being that they were worried that John would file charges against the state.
It was the opinion of the doctors that baby Jacob was struck in the head and this was no accident. In the years to follow, John goes on to sexually abuse young Eric, as well as physically abusing his mother Brenda, and emotionally abusing and isolating them both, making their world very small.
During the autopsy, layers of abuse seem to be present. A healing rib fracture from around the time of the first head injury is also discovered. It's impossible to say exactly when the injury took place, but what is clear is that someone was abusing young Jacob, and that person was most likely John.
Eric Landin, Jacob's brother, has been fighting to get justice for him. However, he faces some obstacles such as the statute of limitations of 6 years on second-degree murder that State Representative Bill Ream has petitioned to have overturned.
Join Robin and I, as well as criminologist Dr. Ashley Wellman, an investigative expert, a legal expert, a forensic psychiatrist, as well as Jacob's brother Eric, as we explore all angles of this case and try to bring awareness, understanding, and hopefully, ultimately, justice for Jacob.
The series starts on March the 1st. Tune in on your favorite podcast app.